By the summer of 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Operation Bagration, launched in June, had annihilated Germany's Army Group Center and recaptured nearly all of Soviet Belarus. The Soviet advance had reached the borders of East Prussia, threatening German territory proper for the first time since the war began. Nazi propaganda had long painted East Prussia as an inviolable bastion of Germandom, a historical heartland untouched by foreign armies since the Napoleonic Wars. Its defense thus carried not only military, but ideological and psychological weight for both the German leadership and the civilian population. The city of Memel, modern-day Klaipėda, located on the Baltic coast, held a unique position within this broader landscape. Annexed by Nazi Germany from Lithuania in 1939, Memel was the northernmost city of East Prussia and a key port on the Baltic Sea. Its location at the intersection of Lithuanian territory and German-administered East Prussia gave it both strategic and symbolic significance. As the Soviet push westward intensified in 1944, Memel became increasingly vital as a logistical node and potential fallback position for German forces retreating from the Baltic states. For the Red Army, its capture would sever the connection between Army Group North in the Baltics and Army Group Center in East Prussia, paving the way for the isolation and eventual destruction of German forces in the north. The political and military context in the Baltic region in 1944 was complex. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had been annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, occupied by Germany in 1941, and were now being reconquered by Soviet forces. The local populations were divided. Some saw the Soviets as liberators, others as returning occupiers. Partisan activity persisted across the region, but its character varied greatly, with pro-Soviet nationalist and anti-Soviet factions all engaging in sabotage, reconnaissance, or resistance against German or Red Army forces. These dynamics created a volatile backdrop as the Soviet High Command formulated its final plans for the encirclement and seizure of Memel. On the German side, the defense of Memel fell under the command of Army Group North, which by late 1944 was under constant pressure across multiple fronts. Wehrmacht leadership in the region was overstretched and increasingly isolated as Soviet breakthroughs in the Central Baltic Corridor drove wedges between German defensive lines. Despite the precarious situation, Hitler insisted that Memel be held at all costs. The city was fortified, with significant efforts made to prepare it for a prolonged siege. Troops from various branches of the German armed forces, including the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe ground units, and naval personnel, were assigned to its defense, along with Volkssturm units and local auxiliaries. The population of Memel, which included both ethnic Germans and Lithuanian civilians, faced growing uncertainty as the front drew closer. German authorities began limited evacuations, prioritizing military families and government personnel, but many civilians were instructed to stay put. Propaganda emphasized the city's role as a bulwark against Bolshevism and discouraged retreat. At the same time, Soviet leaflets and radio broadcasts warned civilians to evacuate or face the consequences of resistance. These psychological pressures compounded the fear and anxiety among the city's inhabitants, many of whom had already endured years of war, rationing, and aerial bombardment. Militarily, the Red Army's preparations for the assault on Memel were part of a broader strategic effort to eliminate German presence in the Baltic region. By mid-October 1944, Soviet forces had reached the Niemen River, cutting off most of Lithuania from East Prussia. The First Baltic Front, under General Hovhannes Bagration, played a central role in the approach toward Memel, coordinating with elements of the Third Belarusian Front to the south and the Second Baltic Front to the north. Soviet intelligence identified Memel as both a military strongpoint and a potential trap, a location where German forces could be surrounded and destroyed if properly isolated from their supply lines. Soviet planning emphasized speed and envelopment. Unlike earlier operations that focused on direct assaults, the Red Army's intent around Memel was to encircle and neutralize the city while continuing their drive toward Königsberg and the rest of East Prussia. The city's proximity to the Baltic Sea limited German options for withdrawal, particularly as the Kriegsmarine had only a limited number of vessels capable of evacuating troops or civilians under fire. For this reason, Memel's defense was expected to devolve into a siege, a prolonged grinding conflict in which Soviet artillery, air power, and encirclement tactics would be decisive. The German High Command, increasingly isolated from battlefield realities, continued to issue orders for Memel's defense even as surrounding territories fell. The refusal to allow tactical withdrawals, combined with the logistical challenges of maintaining supply routes across collapsing fronts, set the stage for a confrontation that would echo the broader collapse of the Eastern Front in its final months. The siege of Memel would not be a single event, but a drawn-out struggle involving encirclement, counterattacks, and urban warfare, culminating in the city's final fall in early 1945. For the German defenders, it was a last stand on the edge of a collapsing empire. For the Soviet Union, it was another step toward the heart of East Prussia and ultimately Berlin. The opening phase of the Siege of Memel began in the final days of September 1944, as the Soviet First Baltic Front advanced westward through northern Lithuania. General Hovhannes Bagramyan, commanding the front, launched the Memel offensive operation on October 5th, with the objective of cutting off the city from the south and southeast, while maintaining pressure on retreating German forces from the Baltic states. The Soviet strategy hinged on encirclement rather than direct assault, seeking to isolate Memel as a fortified pocket, while the bulk of Red Army units continued their push into East Prussia. Initial Soviet thrusts were spearheaded by the 43rd and 2nd Guards armies, supported by armored and artillery formations that had gained significant experience during the summer operations in Belarus and Latvia. The German response was immediate but disorganized. As the Soviet forces advanced from Šiauliai and Tilsit directions, German Army Group North scrambled to reassign units to reinforce Memel's garrison. The 58th Infantry Division, elements of the 7th Panzer Division, and remnants of retreating formations from Latvia were redirected to hold the approaches to the city. The German 3rd Panzer Army attempted to establish defensive positions along the Niemen River and block the Soviet advance across the flat, forested terrain north of Tilsit. However, the Wehrmacht's ability to delay the Soviet movement was severely hampered by poor coordination, fatigue, and a collapsing logistical infrastructure. Soviet reconnaissance units reached the outer defense lines of Memel within the first week of October, having moved rapidly through weakened German positions. The speed of the advance created panic within the German command structure, particularly as units from the north found themselves increasingly at risk of encirclement. Despite orders from Berlin to hold all ground, local commanders began executing limited tactical withdrawals to consolidate defensive lines closer to Memel itself. This decision, though militarily sound, was politically dangerous and frequently overruled by higher command echelons, who insisted that no ground be ceded without direct authorization from Hitler. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command exploited its numerical and material superiority to initiate a pincer movement. Soviet forces attacked from the north along the Baltic coast and simultaneously advanced from the southeast, bypassing heavily defended strongpoints and cutting rail and road links into the city. By mid-October, Memel's only remaining overland connection to German-controlled territory ran through a narrow corridor between the Curonian Lagoon and the Niemen River, under constant threat from Soviet artillery and airstrikes. This development effectively trapped the city, and German engineers began constructing makeshift defensive lines along the city's outskirts in anticipation of a prolonged siege. Within Memel, preparations for urban defense intensified. Civilian authorities, working under the oversight of Wehrmacht and Nazi Party officials, initiated forced labor programs to dig trenches, construct bunkers, and erect barricades throughout the city. The port facilities were reinforced and converted into resupply and evacuation nodes. Schools, warehouses, and public buildings were converted into barracks or ammunition depots. Conscription was extended to include younger boys and older men under the Volkssturm regulations, further militarizing the population. Propaganda reinforced the narrative of Memel as a fortress city, Festung, a final outpost defending German soil from the advancing Soviets. For civilians, daily life rapidly deteriorated. As the Red Army approached, food stocks were rationed, communication with the outside world was severed, and air raids became a regular occurrence. Many families fled via the Baltic Sea, embarking on overloaded naval or civilian vessels bound for Königsberg or Danzig. Those who remained faced both ideological pressure to stay and logistical barriers to departure. German authorities ordered civilian cooperation with military operations and threatened penalties for perceived defeatism or sabotage. At the same time, rumors circulated about Soviet reprisals, fueling fear and further complicating evacuation efforts. The Luftwaffe, weakened by years of attrition, played only a limited role in the early phase of the siege. A few Ju-87 and Fw-190 aircraft operated from airfields around Königsberg to interdict Soviet movements and provide support to ground forces, but their impact was minimal. The Soviet Air Force, on the other hand, enjoyed local air superiority and used it to conduct reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction missions. Bridges, rail junctions, and German troop concentrations were targeted daily, further complicating German attempts to stabilize the front. By late October 1944, the Soviet pincers had effectively severed Memel from the rest of German-held East Prussia. The First Baltic Front succeeded in isolating the city, leaving behind elements of the German 58th Infantry Division, Volkssturm militia, and supporting naval units under siege conditions. Rather than launching a direct assault on the city, Soviet commanders chose to maintain encirclement, apply artillery pressure, and wait for attrition to weaken the defenders. This approach mirrored Soviet tactics used elsewhere on the Eastern Front, where frontal assaults had proven costly in similar urban environments. Memel, now encircled and bombarded, had entered a new phase. The opening movements had achieved Soviet operational goals and left the defenders with no prospect of reinforcement or breakout. While combat on the city's periphery continued, the stage was set for a prolonged and grinding confrontation that would test the endurance of the garrison and the will of the civilian population. What followed would be not only a battle for territory, but a struggle over the meaning of resistance itself, fought in cellars, harbor piers, and ruined streets at the edge of a collapsing empire. With Memel effectively encircled by late October 1944, both the German and Soviet commands turned their attention to the broader strategic goals of the siege and the implications for the surrounding region. For the Red Army, isolating Memel was only part of a wider operational framework aimed at dismantling German control in the Baltic and opening the path to East Prussia. The Soviet First Baltic Front, having cut off the city's landward access, now shifted resources to reinforce pressure on the Latvian front and prepare for operations toward Königsberg. Memel, though not the primary Soviet objective at this stage, remained a dangerous pocket that could not be ignored. The siege required containment forces, artillery support, and continued logistical planning to prevent German breakout attempts or naval evacuation under cover of darkness. The Soviet High Command designated several rifle divisions and supporting artillery units to maintain pressure on the garrison. These formations established a semi-permanent line around the city's southern and eastern perimeter, deploying mortars, heavy guns, and observation posts to interdict movement and restrict supply inflows. Soviet armored elements, having no utility in the narrow, muddy terrain around Memel, were withdrawn or redeployed elsewhere. Meanwhile, supply chains were restructured to support the siege effort using rail lines pushed forward from newly captured Lithuanian territory. Soviet propaganda, broadcast by loudspeaker and leaflet drops, urged the German garrison to surrender and promised humane treatment for civilians and soldiers alike, though few took the offer seriously. The German command, meanwhile, undertook its own strategic calculations. Hitler remained adamant that Memel be held at all costs, designating it a Festung, or fortress, to be defended to the last man. The city's port was seen as a crucial link to the Baltic Sea, offering a potential evacuation route not only for troops, but also for fleeing civilians from across East Prussia and the collapsing northern front. The Kriegsmarine increased its presence in the harbor, deploying minesweepers, transport vessels, and anti-aircraft barges to facilitate both resupply and withdrawal under increasingly dangerous conditions. At the same time, Army Group North, reorganized as Army Group Courland, was ordered to hold its ground in Latvia, further isolating Memel by denying it any overland support from the north. Logistically, the situation for the German defenders deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition and medical supplies dwindled as aerial resupply proved inconsistent and hazardous. The limited shipping capacity from Königsberg was focused on evacuating the wounded and key personnel, with only a trickle of materiel arriving in return. Fuel shortages grounded the few remaining vehicles within the city, and horse-drawn transport became the primary method of moving supplies. Food rations were cut significantly, and civilian resources were requisitioned to support the military. Priority was given to frontline troops and key command personnel, leaving much of the civilian population to rely on soup kitchens, barter systems, or unofficial black market channels. German defensive doctrine in Memel emphasized layered resistance. The outer defensive belt, composed of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire entanglements, was reinforced with machine gun nests and artillery positions. Behind this line, mobile infantry reserves were stationed to counter Soviet probing attacks. Within the city itself, key intersections were fortified, cellars converted into ammunition stores, and sniper positions established in church towers and upper stories of intact buildings. The Kriegsmarine contributed naval artillery fire from ships docked in the harbor, further enhancing the firepower available to the garrison. Despite these efforts, morale began to erode under constant bombardment and the recognition that relief was unlikely. German propaganda efforts continued to portray the defense of Memel as a vital patriotic duty. Radio broadcasts celebrated local commanders, emphasized the threat of Soviet atrocities, and portrayed the battle as a bulwark protecting the German heartland. However, internal Wehrmacht reports indicated rising desertion attempts, low morale among Volkssturm units, and the psychological toll of prolonged siege conditions. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline as casualty rates mounted and unit cohesion weakened. Efforts to integrate recently drafted youths and convalescent soldiers into combat formations often failed, resulting in disorganized and ineffective resistance in key sectors. For civilians, the siege became increasingly unbearable. With power and water systems damaged by Soviet shelling, daily life centered around basic survival. Public buildings and church basements were converted into bomb shelters, often overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Medical services were overwhelmed, and outbreaks of disease, especially dysentery and influenza, spread rapidly through the population. Evacuation was possible only by sea, and space aboard outbound vessels was limited and tightly controlled. Families were separated as some were permitted to leave, while others remained behind. Many chose to stay, either due to loyalty, fear, or lack of information about the true conditions awaiting them elsewhere. Despite the isolation, the German garrison launched several local counterattacks in November and December 1944, hoping to disrupt Soviet siege lines or regain access to supply routes. These efforts, though occasionally successful in recapturing terrain, failed to achieve lasting results. Soviet forces responded with artillery barrages and localized infantry assaults that reinforced their perimeter. The Red Army showed no urgency to storm the city outright, preferring instead to maintain a war of attrition. Their commanders understood that time, pressure, and resource denial would accomplish what a costly frontal assault might not. By the end of December, Memel remained under German control, but only tenuously so. The strategic goals of both sides had become increasingly clear. For the Soviets, the siege served as a means to contain a pocket of resistance and eliminate a strategic foothold, without diverting critical resources from the main front in East Prussia. For the Germans, holding Memel was no longer about victory, but about delaying the inevitable collapse, evacuating what they could, and fulfilling orders from a regime that still believed in total war, even as its empire crumbled. The siege would grind on into the new year, with both sides adapting their strategies as the balance of power continued to shift decisively in favor of the Red Army. In early January 1945, the siege of Memel entered a new phase marked by intensifying Soviet pressure and the continuing degradation of German defensive capacity. With the city completely isolated by land, the Soviet First Baltic Front maintained its strategy of sustained encirclement rather than direct frontal assault. The Red Army's artillery units increased their shelling of German positions within the urban perimeter, targeting key infrastructure, supply depots, and suspected command centers. Observation posts positioned in the surrounding countryside directed precision fire, gradually wearing down the defenders' ability to coordinate, resupply, or maneuver effectively. The opening weeks of the new year signaled the beginning of the end. Soviet field commanders reinforced their lines with additional infantry regiments to ensure the containment perimeter remained unbroken. These units, largely composed of seasoned rifle divisions and supported by light artillery and mortars, were tasked with maintaining constant pressure through localized attacks and infiltration attempts. Reconnaissance patrols probed German defenses by night, while forward artillery observers adjusted barrages during daylight. Soviet air superiority allowed for low-altitude reconnaissance flights that mapped German trenches and defensive positions, aiding in the coordination of systematic bombardment and subsequent infantry pressure. Within Memel, the German military command faced a rapidly worsening situation. Daily artillery shelling disrupted communications, damaged defensive works, and inflicted a steady toll on personnel and equipment. Ammunition supplies, particularly for heavy weapons and anti-tank systems, had become critically low. The Kriegsmarine's ability to supply the garrison via sea had been reduced by Soviet air and naval interdiction. As Soviet aircraft patrolled the eastern Baltic and Soviet submarines laid mines along maritime routes, winter storms further complicated naval logistics, grounding supply convoys and making loading operations hazardous and inefficient. German countermeasures relied increasingly on short-range defensive tactics. Mobile reserves, once capable of limited counterattacks, were now largely pinned in place to hold key intersections and prevent breaches of the inner perimeter. The Volkssturm, composed of poorly trained and minimally equipped militia, was employed in static defense roles or support tasks, freeing up regular infantry for frontline duties. These formations suffered high casualties when exposed to direct Soviet attacks or indirect fire. Morale within the garrison plummeted as units rotated through crumbling defensive positions, with little hope of reinforcement or relief. Civilians remaining in the city faced deteriorating conditions with little prospect of improvement. The loss of electricity and clean water rendered sanitation almost non-existent. Food was strictly rationed, with supplies dwindling to a fraction of subsistence levels. Soup kitchens operated under military supervision, but their capacity was limited, and queues stretched for hours in freezing temperatures. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses spread rapidly in makeshift shelters. Medical personnel, mostly conscripted doctors and nurses, struggled to treat the wounded and the sick without adequate medicine, equipment, or heat. Throughout January, the German command continued to request permission for a partial evacuation or withdrawal to the west, citing untenable conditions and the lack of operational purpose in holding Memel. These appeals were consistently denied by higher command, including directives from Hitler's headquarters reaffirming the city's status as a fortress to be held at all costs. Despite this, some local commanders quietly prioritized evacuation of technical personnel, wounded soldiers, and selected civilians. Small naval convoys, mostly composed of torpedo boats and transport barges, carried evacuees to Pillau and other ports in East Prussia when weather permitted. These efforts, while saving some, were insufficient in scale and increasingly dangerous due to the tightening Soviet stranglehold. Soviet psychological operations intensified during this period. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands, and leaflets promising humane treatment were dropped over German lines. Soviet broadcasts cited the destruction of other German cities and the inevitability of Memel's fall. These efforts were aimed at undermining the will of both troops and civilians to continue resistance. While the effectiveness of these measures varied, internal reports from German units noted a rise in desertions, especially among Volkssturm elements and non-German auxiliaries. In response, German military police imposed stricter controls, and summary executions were carried out in a few documented cases to deter further collapse of discipline. Despite these pressures, the Soviet command remained cautious. With major operations planned against Königsberg and the core of East Prussia, the Red Army could not afford heavy casualties in a street-by-street battle for Memel unless absolutely necessary. Instead, Soviet planners emphasized containment, degradation, and psychological erosion. The siege was a tool of attrition, slow, methodical, and resource-efficient. Red Army artillery fire steadily increased in volume and precision, gradually reducing the city's capacity to function as a military base or staging ground for any counter-operation. Meanwhile, the larger strategic picture rendered the defense of Memel increasingly irrelevant. Soviet forces to the south were advancing on Königsberg, and to the north, Army Group Courland was effectively isolated in Latvia. Memel, once considered a vital link in the German defense of the Baltic region, had become a symbolic holdout, its value more political than military. Yet, even as its strategic importance declined, the cost of holding the city mounted daily. By the final week of January, it was clear to both sides that the end was approaching. Soviet artillery had devastated many of the city's industrial and logistical facilities. The harbor was choked with damaged vessels and debris. German units were under strength, undersupplied, and increasingly demoralized. Local commanders began consolidating positions, preparing fallback lines, and making quiet preparations for a final evacuation or surrender. But no official order came. The siege ground onward, consuming men, munitions, and hope, even as the broader German position in East Prussia began to collapse entirely under the weight of the Soviet winter offensive. By early February 1945, the siege of Memel had reached its most critical and destructive phase. The Soviet First Baltic Front, maintaining its encirclement and pressure campaign, now began to tighten the ring around the city, with increased frequency and intensity of artillery bombardments, probing assaults, and strategic demolitions. The once systematic containment strategy shifted gradually toward offensive preparation. Though a full-scale assault had not yet been ordered, the Soviet command had concluded that the remaining German resistance could soon be overcome through direct military action, with minimal diversion of forces from the broader East Prussian offensive. The condition of Memel's defenders had by this point deteriorated beyond the threshold of operational sustainability. The German garrison, composed of the remnants of regular Wehrmacht infantry, Kriegsmarine personnel, Volkssturm, and auxiliary units, was exhausted. Unit strength was down by more than 50% across most formations. Ammunition stocks, particularly for artillery and anti-tank weapons, were critically low. Several batteries were reduced to firing single shells per hour to conserve resources. Machine gun nests that had once guarded every key intersection now lay silent, their crews withdrawn or eliminated. Communication systems had broken down almost entirely. Field radios functioned intermittently, and telephone cables were destroyed by constant shelling. Orders were transmitted orally or by runner, further eroding command efficiency. In the urban center, destruction was nearly total. Soviet shellfire and sporadic air raids had devastated entire blocks of the city. Fires smoldered in residential districts, warehouses, and dockyards. Rubble clogged the streets, impeding both movement and logistics. Many defensive positions were buried or isolated by the debris. The Kriegsmarine vessels still moored in Memel's harbor were largely out of action, either sunk, damaged, or repurposed as stationary artillery platforms. Several ships had been scuttled to prevent capture. The harbor itself had become unnavigable due to wreckage, mines, and blockaded channels. The possibility of organized evacuation by sea was, by February, virtually nil. Civilians still trapped in the city faced the most severe consequences. Those who had not been evacuated earlier now lived in basements and underground shelters with little food or medical care. Disease was rampant. Hunger and exposure took a steady toll. Soviet shelling, though primarily aimed at military targets, inevitably struck civilian areas. Corpses lay unburied in alleys and cellars, and many families had no means of contacting missing relatives or securing burial. Medical staff worked without anesthetics or antibiotics. Most surgeries were amputations. Children and the elderly died daily from cold and malnutrition. The once functioning soup kitchens had ceased operations. Military units confiscated any remaining food for the frontline troops. German leadership inside the city attempted to maintain cohesion, but the situation had become increasingly chaotic. General command passed between officers as casualties mounted. Some battalions had no formal leadership by mid-February. There were no meaningful reserves left to plug gaps or reinforce threatened positions. At several points, Soviet forces breached the outer perimeter, but were repelled by hastily gathered ad hoc squads of rear echelon troops and naval gunners. These breaches, though temporary, further demonstrated the fragility of German defenses and signaled to Soviet planners that a final push would likely succeed with acceptable losses. Despite the increasingly hopeless position, Hitler's headquarters in Berlin continued to issue orders forbidding surrender or evacuation. Memel was to be defended to the last cartridge. Internal reports from the German High Command revealed growing frustration among frontline commanders who viewed the continued defense as wasteful and tactically irrelevant. Nevertheless, efforts to organize a breakout or negotiate terms were strictly forbidden. Communications from Hitler's staff emphasized ideological resolve over military logic, echoing earlier fortress declarations from other doomed cities like Budapest and Königsberg. Soviet preparations for the final assault intensified during the second week of February. Artillery was repositioned for maximum coverage. New observation posts were established in recently cleared areas along the eastern approach. Forward units rehearsed urban breach tactics, utilizing lessons learned from the sieges of Vitebsk, Mogilev, and other fortified cities in previous months. Political commissars delivered final instructions to troops, emphasizing discipline, adherence to Geneva protocols regarding prisoners, and the symbolic importance of crushing the last German stronghold in the Baltic region. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry patrols had begun testing German defenses through nightly raids, reconnaissance in force, and infiltration attempts. These probes confirmed that many sectors of the city were only lightly defended, with some positions manned by understrength squads or completely abandoned. In several cases, Soviet patrols entered areas of Memel unopposed and withdrew after collecting intelligence, leaving behind leaflets and messages calling for surrender. The psychological impact on the German troops and civilians was significant. Desertions increased. Civilians began moving closer to Soviet lines, waving white flags or attempting to negotiate safe passage. Most were turned back or ignored, as Soviet commanders waited for a formal capitulation or the signal to commence the final assault. As February reached its third week, weather conditions worsened. Heavy snowfall and freezing winds slowed Soviet movements and made living conditions for both sides even more severe. But the larger strategic situation now overshadowed the local realities. Königsberg was under direct Soviet assault. The Wehrmacht's capacity to operate in East Prussia was collapsing. Army Group North was cut off in Courland. There would be no relief, no breakthrough, and no strategic justification for continued resistance in Memel. On February 26th, Soviet artillery began a final pre-assault bombardment. It was the heaviest single-day shelling of the entire siege. Over 2,000 shells were fired in 24 hours. German defenses in the outer sectors crumbled. Casualties were immense. Firestorms erupted across the dock district and industrial zones. The final chapter of the siege was about to begin, not as a pitched battle, but as a swift collapse of a garrison that had long since passed the point of meaningful resistance. The German command now faced a stark choice: annihilation or surrender, while the Red Army prepared to deliver the final blow to what remained of Nazi controls on the Baltic coast. On the morning of February 27, 1945, Soviet forces commenced the final assault on Memel. After weeks of methodical preparation and constant attrition, the Red Army determined that the German garrison, exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized, could no longer offer sustained resistance. The operation began with a massive coordinated artillery barrage that struck suspected command posts, strong points, and transportation hubs across the city. The opening salvo, lasting nearly 3 hours, was followed by a rolling barrage designed to suppress any surviving defenders as Soviet infantry formations advanced behind a wall of fire and steel. The assault was led by select units of the 1st Baltic Front, which had been specifically trained and equipped for urban combat. Rifle divisions, supported by engineers and sappers, entered the eastern and southeastern suburbs of Memel. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads preceded the main infantry waves, targeting fortified basements, bunkers, and sniper nests. Combat engineers cleared minefields and breached barricades with explosives. The initial Soviet gains were rapid. Entire blocks were taken within hours, as German resistance collapsed in many sectors. In some areas, Soviet troops met no opposition at all, only deserted buildings, abandoned weapons, and disoriented civilians. German defenses, though still capable of isolated resistance, had largely disintegrated. Many remaining units were fragmented, leaderless, and operating on their own initiative. Communication with the Central Command was erratic, and coordination between sectors had broken down. Some pockets of defenders, composed of hardened Wehrmacht troops or Kriegsmarine detachments, continued to fight stubbornly, engaging Soviet attackers in house-to-house combat. These last stands were most common around the harbor district and key intersections in the city center. However, they lacked reinforcements, supplies, and coherent objectives, serving more to delay than repel the advancing Soviet forces. The civilian population was caught between collapsing German defenses and advancing Soviet troops. Thousands had sought shelter in basements and tunnels beneath the city, many of which were now collapsing or inaccessible due to rubble and flooding. As the Red Army pushed deeper into Memel, reports emerged of civilians attempting to surrender en masse. Soviet troops, operating under orders to respect non-combatants and expedite the end of hostilities, directed civilians to designated assembly points. Nevertheless, chaos prevailed. The collapse of public order, combined with the trauma of prolonged siege conditions, led to confusion, fear, and outbreaks of looting in some areas. By February 28th, Soviet forces had secured the majority of the city. The last pockets of organized German resistance held out in the port area, where remnants of the Kriegsmarine attempted to mount a final defense around a handful of beached ships and naval facilities. These forces, numbering only a few hundred men, lacked heavy weapons and were subjected to intense shelling and close-quarters assaults. A Soviet amphibious detachment, launched from nearby coastal positions, entered the harbor from the sea, completing the encirclement and neutralizing the final axis of escape. Faced with total collapse, what remained of the German command structure initiated scattered surrender attempts. However, the absence of centralized authority meant that no formal capitulation was issued. Surrendered units were processed individually by Soviet command posts. Senior German officers captured during the final assault were transported to rear echelon facilities for interrogation. Many others had discarded their uniforms and attempted to blend in with civilian refugees, though this rarely succeeded due to language barriers, appearance, and the presence of Soviet military police. The capture of Memel marked the definitive end of Nazi Germany's presence on the Baltic coast of Lithuania. Soviet flags were raised over key administrative buildings, and engineers began immediate efforts to clear streets and restore basic infrastructure. Soviet logistical units moved in to establish supply depots and triage stations, while military police began registering civilians and assessing damage. Reports from the Red Army noted that the city was almost entirely uninhabitable, with water systems destroyed, food stocks depleted, and shelter scarce. The estimated number of civilian survivors was fewer than 1,000, many of them children, elderly, or wounded. The strategic value of the victory was largely symbolic. Memel no longer offered a viable naval base or military hub. However, its capture eliminated the last German stronghold in Lithuania and freed Soviet forces to concentrate fully on East Prussia and Königsberg. It also served to sever any lingering connections between Army Group Courland and the Reich proper, further isolating German forces trapped in the Baltics. For the Soviet command, the fall of Memel was a validation of siege tactics centered on attrition, encirclement, and psychological warfare, a strategy that would be used again in the coming battle for Königsberg. In Berlin, news of Memel's fall was received with a mix of denial and silence. Nazi propaganda made no immediate mention of the city's capture, instead focusing on the ongoing defense of Königsberg and the so-called heroic resistance in East Prussia. Only weeks later, in a brief official communiqué, the regime acknowledged the loss, characterizing it as a temporary setback in a long and noble struggle against Bolshevism. By then, however, the war had clearly turned irreversibly against Germany, and the myth of fortress cities holding out to the last man was wearing thin. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Memel was both a military and political milestone. It reinforced the narrative of liberating Soviet and Baltic lands from fascist occupation, even as debates over post-war control of the region simmered beneath the surface. The Red Army's success added to its prestige, bolstering morale as the final campaigns of the European War entered their decisive phase. Yet the cost was evident in the devastation of the city, the suffering of its people, and the enduring scars left on a landscape that had once served as a frontier of imperial ambition and violent occupation. Following the fall of Memel at the end of February 1945, the immediate post-siege environment was defined by efforts to stabilize the city, exploit the tactical success, and adjust to the shifting demands of the Eastern Front. For the Soviet military, the city was no longer a battleground, but rather a logistical and administrative problem. While Memel had ceased to be a strategic asset, it now served as a symbol of irreversible Soviet advance and the final dissolution of German control in the Baltic region. Soviet units tasked with occupation began reorganizing their lines and redeploying toward East Prussia. Forward elements moved south and southwest to support the ongoing offensives toward Königsberg, while secondary and reserve units remained in Memel to maintain order and secure supply routes. Soviet engineers, sappers, and transport troops were brought in to clear debris from main roads, restore dock infrastructure, and establish functioning supply depots for fuel, food, and ammunition. The ruins of Memel, while largely unusable as a base of operations, still provided a critical foothold for maintaining Soviet presence along the Baltic coastline. Efforts to assess and assist the civilian population were complicated by the extensive destruction and chaos left in the wake of the siege. Soviet authorities implemented emergency protocols, rationing, medical triage, and the registration of survivors. NKVD personnel conducted initial screenings of civilians to identify suspected collaborators or German sympathizers. Given Memel's status as a Germanized city, with a majority ethnic German population prior to the war, these investigations often resulted in mass internments or forced deportations to the Soviet interior. Families were separated, and civilians were subjected to intense questioning, contributing to a climate of fear and uncertainty. At the same time, German prisoners of war captured during the siege were processed and sent to holding camps in the Soviet rear. These prisoners were primarily from remnants of the Kriegsmarine and infantry units who had surrendered during the final days of combat. While the Soviet command maintained nominal compliance with international conventions on prisoner treatment, conditions in the camps were austere. The wounded received only basic care, and logistical challenges meant that food and shelter were minimal during the first weeks following the city's capture. Prisoners were later used in labor battalions for reconstruction projects both in Memel and elsewhere. The operational success of the Memel siege influenced Soviet military doctrine in the immediate term. The First Baltic Front's ability to isolate, degrade, and ultimately neutralize a fortified city without costly frontal assault reinforced a broader strategic preference for envelopment and attrition over direct confrontation in urban settings. The lessons of Memel would be applied in the assault on Königsberg, where similar tactics were refined and deployed with even greater precision. Soviet commanders circulated internal memoranda analyzing the siege, with emphasis on artillery coordination, psychological operations, and civilian control mechanisms. Meanwhile, in Germany, the loss of Memel was a further blow to the already deteriorating morale of the Wehrmacht. Internal reports from Army Group North indicated that remaining units in Courland interpreted the fall of Memel as proof that no relief would be forthcoming from the Reich. German propaganda tried to downplay the significance of the event, But for many officers and soldiers trapped in the Baltic pocket, the symbolic importance of losing the last East Prussian port on the Baltic was undeniable. The logistical implications were equally severe. Without Memel, the resupply of Courland became nearly impossible, and the region was effectively written off by the German High Command. The civilian exodus from Memel had already occurred in stages before the final assault, but Soviet authorities now initiated a second phase of population displacement. Ethnic Germans were either evacuated forcibly or encouraged to leave under Soviet oversight. Lithuanian and Latvian civilians, many of whom had been brought to Memel as laborers or had fled the fighting elsewhere, faced a more complex fate. Some were repatriated, while others were absorbed into the Soviet administrative system, categorized according to loyalty or political utility. The Soviets aimed to re-establish political control over Memel by installing pro-Soviet local administrations, integrating the city more directly into the Lithuanian SSR. Amid this reshuffling, partisan groups and resistance elements attempted to reassert influence in the surrounding countryside. Anti-Soviet Lithuanian partisans, known as the Forest Brothers, sought to exploit the temporary vacuum of power left by the departing German forces. Though the Red Army quickly reasserted control over rural zones through sweeps and security operations, sporadic clashes continued throughout the spring of 1945. These low-intensity conflicts were a prelude to the broader post-war insurgency that would define Soviet relations with the Baltic states for years to come. For the city of Memel, the aftermath of the siege marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Under Soviet occupation, the German legacy of the city was systematically dismantled. Place names were changed, institutions were repurposed, and any symbols of the prior regime were removed. The city's infrastructure, already devastated by months of combat and shelling, was further repurposed to suit Soviet logistical needs. Rail lines were repaired to connect with eastward routes. Warehouses were rebuilt or converted for Red Army use. Memel ceased to exist as a German cultural and administrative entity. It was now a Soviet holding. In the weeks that followed, the tempo of the wider Eastern Front accelerated. Soviet forces surged westward, engaging German units across the Vistula and pushing deeper into the heart of East Prussia. As the war neared its end, Memel became less a focal point of military operations, and more a case study in total war's consequences. Strategic success measured not only in captured territory, but in the erasure and reconstruction of cities, populations, and identities. The once contested port had become a quiet stronghold, scarred but functional, reshaped by the victors and awaiting its place in the post-war order. By mid-March 1945, the situation in Memel had stabilized under Soviet control, but the broader region remained volatile. While the city itself no longer served as a frontline stronghold, its strategic location on the Baltic coast made it a critical node for Soviet logistics, intelligence, and rear area operations. The Red Army, having achieved its tactical goals, now focused on cementing its political and military authority over the surrounding territories, while preparing for final operations against Königsberg and the remnants of German resistance in East Prussia. The Soviet military administration moved quickly to institutionalize control. Soviet authorities initiated sweeping administrative reforms intended to integrate Memel into the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. These reforms included the appointment of local pro-Soviet officials, the establishment of party structures, and the nationalization of remaining industrial and transportation assets. Educational facilities, newspapers, and cultural institutions were reorganized to align with Soviet ideological and linguistic norms. German language signage, literature, and records were systematically removed or destroyed. In this process, the city's pre-war German identity was deliberately and comprehensively dismantled. Meanwhile, remnants of the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm scattered across rural East Prussia continued to attempt ad hoc resistance or evasion. Soviet counterinsurgency units, along with NKVD detachments, launched extensive sweep operations through forests and isolated villages around Memel. These operations were not limited to military targets. Suspected sympathizers, former administrators, and even civilians accused of anti-Soviet attitudes were arrested, deported, or executed. The campaign reflected broader Soviet policies across newly reoccupied or annexed territories. Military victory was to be followed by total political dominance. The refugee crisis that had preceded the siege now returned in a new form. Thousands of civilians, displaced by the war or returning from earlier evacuations, attempted to resettle in Memel or nearby districts. Many arrived to find their homes destroyed, occupied, or repurposed by Soviet forces. With housing in ruins and infrastructure barely functional, most lived in makeshift shelters or Soviet-controlled barracks. Food shortages persisted, and rationing remained in place well into the summer. Soviet authorities imposed strict controls on movement and association, complicating any efforts to rebuild community networks or local economies. In parallel, the Soviet High Command reassessed the value of Memel as a military port. Though the harbor had sustained significant damage, it remained potentially valuable for resupply and redeployment in support of the Baltic Fleet and upcoming operations in the Courland Pocket. Repair teams were brought in to clear wreckage, survey the underwater channels, and assess the feasibility of restoring port functionality. Temporary logistical hubs were established nearby to handle material flows as reconstruction continued. Soviet engineers also expanded the rail infrastructure leading inland, connecting Memel more firmly with Lithuanian SSR nodes and supply chains supporting the northern sectors of the front. While the city's role in combat operations had ended, Memel continued to feature prominently in Soviet propaganda. It was portrayed as a liberated city, a symbol of fascism's defeat and Soviet resilience. Official narratives emphasized the Red Army's discipline, the heroism of local partisans, and the supposed warm reception of Soviet troops by the oppressed workers of the city. In reality, the local reception had been mixed, shaped by ethnic tensions, wartime suffering, and fear of reprisals. Nevertheless, statues, memorials, and slogans appeared in central locations, turning the physical space of the city into a canvas for the new regime's message. At the same time, elements of the Lithuanian resistance, including the Forest Brothers and smaller nationalist cells, remained active in the surrounding region. Their operations were limited in scale and scope, but they challenged Soviet authority through sabotage, assassinations, and the distribution of anti-communist literature. These actions prompted further NKVD crackdowns, including mass arrests and public trials. Memel, though pacified on the surface, now sat on the edge of a simmering insurgency that would evolve into a long-term challenge to Soviet rule across the Baltic states. From a military perspective, Memel's capture allowed the Red Army to tighten its grip on East Prussia. The city served as a model for the handling of fortified urban areas and their integration into Soviet systems of control. Soviet field reports compiled after the siege praised the efficiency of siege tactics, the coordination between infantry and engineers, and the successful isolation of the German garrison. These findings were disseminated among other fronts as doctrinal lessons in the final stages of the war. Simultaneously, the psychological impact of Memel's fall rippled outward. For German units still holding out in Königsberg or Courland, it confirmed that the Eastern Front was collapsing. For civilians and military officials across East Prussia, it reinforced the inevitability of Soviet occupation and the accompanying destruction of the old order. In Berlin, Hitler's inner circle received reports from the region with increasing despair, though they remained ideologically committed to prolonged resistance regardless of military logic. The months following Memel's capture saw the gradual fading of its direct military importance. As Soviet advances reached Berlin, and as Germany's unconditional surrender loomed, the city transitioned fully into its new role as a Soviet-administered outpost. The ruins of Memel were cleared selectively, based on military utility rather than civilian need. Reconstruction was slow and uneven, with priority given to facilities beneficial to the Soviet state. Yet beneath this facade of order, the scars of war remained visible and deep. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Generations of German cultural presence vanished within weeks. Survivors, whether Lithuanian, German, or Russian-speaking, now lived under surveillance, suspicion, and the weight of totalitarian transformation. Memel had survived the siege, but in doing so, it had ceased to exist in any form recognizable to its pre-war inhabitants. It was now a city repurposed by victors for victors. Its future dictated not by local will, but by geopolitical ambition and the machinery of empire. By April 1945, as the war in Europe approached its conclusion, the final transformation of Memel into a Soviet stronghold was nearly complete. While active combat had long since moved westward, the city remained a staging ground for Soviet operations and a laboratory for post-war control. It also became a focal point in the broader Soviet campaign to redefine national borders, population compositions, and political systems in the former eastern territories of Nazi Germany. One of the most immediate consequences of the siege and its aftermath was the forced demographic shift that followed. The ethnic German population of Memel, already reduced by wartime evacuations and casualties, faced systematic expulsion or deportation. Soviet directives classified most remaining Germans as non-citizens or hostile nationals, and subjected them to either internment or forced resettlement. Trains and convoys began transporting German civilians, many of them women, elderly, and children, out of the region. These movements were poorly provisioned and often fatal, with many perishing en route from exposure, disease, or starvation. Simultaneously, the Soviet authorities began the process of repopulating the city with politically reliable citizens. Settlers were brought in from various parts of the Soviet Union, including Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian territories, as part of a planned Sovietization effort. These newcomers were incentivized with promises of land, employment, and housing, though the reality was often harsh. They encountered devastated infrastructure, a hostile climate, and lingering tension from both local resistance and wartime trauma. Nonetheless, their presence altered the ethnic and cultural makeup of Memel irreversibly, cementing Soviet demographic dominance. As political control deepened, the NKVD expanded its security apparatus across the city and surrounding region. Surveillance intensified, informant networks were established, former residents were subjected to loyalty tests, and even those who had cooperated during the Soviet assault found themselves under scrutiny. The Soviet administration launched purges of suspected collaborators, former German officials, and anti-communist partisans. Trials were conducted with minimal transparency and sentences were often preordained. Execution, long-term imprisonment, or deportation to labor camps in the Gulag system became common outcomes. On the military front, Memel's harbor remained of limited utility despite reconstruction efforts. While some naval operations resumed, the damage sustained during the siege, combined with the city's diminished strategic value after the fall of East Prussia, relegated the port to a secondary role. The Baltic Fleet instead focused its assets on larger, more accessible ports like Liepāja and Riga. Still, Memel housed several logistical depots and served as a transfer point for Soviet units redeploying along the Baltic or into Central Europe. Beyond the city, the countryside remained a contested space. Anti-Soviet partisans continued to harass Soviet patrols, attack infrastructure, and distribute nationalist propaganda. In response, Soviet forces undertook punitive raids, collective arrests, and village burnings, tactics aimed at both neutralizing resistance and discouraging civilian support. These counterinsurgency efforts, though effective in the short term, further alienated local populations and ensured that low-level unrest would persist for years, becoming part of the larger Baltic insurgency. Internationally, the fate of Memel was a microcosm of the shifting post-war order. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allies had effectively conceded Eastern Europe to Soviet influence. Though not discussed in detail, territories like Memel were understood to fall under Soviet jurisdiction. Western recognition of the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states, including Lithuania, was never formalized de jure, but the reality on the ground was not contested. Thus, Memel's absorption into the Lithuanian SSR proceeded unopposed by any external power. This new geopolitical reality was mirrored in how the city was portrayed both internally and externally. Soviet media presented Memel as a liberated city that had been returned to its rightful place within the Soviet family. Official histories erased the Germanic past, highlighting instead the city's ancient Baltic roots and its supposed natural belonging within a socialist Lithuanian framework. Wartime destruction was framed as necessary sacrifice, and the rebuilding process was cast as a testament to socialist progress and resilience. Infrastructure projects were launched, albeit unevenly. Roads were rebuilt, rail lines repaired, and essential services slowly restored. Education and propaganda institutions received particular attention. Russian language schools were prioritized, while Lithuanian institutions were brought under strict party supervision. Any remaining German cultural landmarks, including churches, libraries, and cemeteries, were often demolished or repurposed, further erasing the city's historical identity. In this way, Memel was transformed not just physically, but ideologically. For returning Soviet veterans and settlers, Memel was a city of contradiction, a place of triumph and suffering, of victory and ruin. Official ceremonies commemorated the city's liberation, but these celebrations were often marred by the visible desolation still surrounding them. Buildings lay in rubble, streets were lined with scars of artillery strikes. The psychological toll of the siege and subsequent repression hung in the air. Even among the victors, there was a sense of unease, a recognition that what had been won was a place hollowed out by war. As the Red Army prepared for its final drive toward Berlin, Memel became a forgotten frontier, overshadowed by the scale of events unfolding further west. Yet within the city's ruins, the dynamics of Soviet post-war policy were already playing out. The suppression of dissent, the manipulation of history, the replacement of populations, and the assertion of imperial dominance under the guise of liberation. Memel had served as a bastion of German militarism. Now it was being refashioned into a cornerstone of Soviet authority in the Baltic. Its transformation was complete in structure, but far from accepted in spirit, an uneasy legacy that would reverberate for decades. In the final weeks of the war, Memel, renamed Klaipėda under Soviet rule, stood as both a symbol of Soviet victory and a warning of the costs of total war. While it no longer held frontline strategic value, its fate reflected the broader transformation of East Central Europe under Soviet dominance. The city's erasure as a German enclave, its incorporation into the Lithuanian SSR, and its physical and demographic reconstruction all served a singular purpose: to reforge the region's identity within a post-war order defined by Stalin's geopolitical aims. Klaipėda became a showcase for Soviet reconstruction and ideological messaging, though in reality the process was slow, uneven, and often marked by coercion. Soviet planners launched ambitious rebuilding programs focused on core infrastructure, rail links, administrative buildings, docks, and housing. However, material shortages, damaged logistics networks, and resistance from both environment and populace hampered progress. Much of the city remained a patchwork of ruins and half-functioning facilities well into the early 1950s. The symbolic importance of Klaipėda extended beyond bricks and mortar. Soviet historiography quickly integrated the city's liberation into the official war narrative. School curricula, public monuments, and national holidays included references to Memel's siege as a decisive step in defeating fascism. A large war memorial was erected overlooking the port, inscribed with Soviet slogans and adorned with imagery portraying the Red Army as heroic liberators. Official photography and film often depicted carefully curated scenes of Soviet flags flying above city ruins, workers clearing debris, and children attending newly opened schools, visual narratives that mask the forced migrations, repression, and cultural erasure behind the scenes. As with much of the Baltics, Klaipėda's assimilation into the Soviet Union created long-term tensions. The expulsion of the German population, followed by the imposition of Soviet rule, erased centuries of the city's Germanic identity. This transformation was not simply a political realignment, but an enforced cultural reprogramming. Local languages and traditions were sidelined in favor of Russian language instruction and ideological conformity. The city's Lutheran churches were either closed, demolished, or converted for secular use. German street names were replaced, archives were censored, and traces of pre-war life were systematically removed from public memory. Despite these efforts, memories of the siege and occupation lingered. Among survivors, both Lithuanian and displaced Germans, the trauma of bombardment, deportation, and totalitarian control endured. Oral histories, letters, and smuggled records preserved a counter-narrative to the state's official version. These private recollections would only surface decades later, but they documented the lived experience of a city caught between empires, ravaged not just by war, but by the ideological machinery of its conquerors. In military terms, the fall of Memel was a microcosm of the Eastern Front's endgame. It illustrated the efficacy of Soviet siege warfare, the logistical complexity of coastal operations, and the extent to which Germany's military apparatus had crumbled. It also marked the end of East Prussia as a German stronghold, a region long mythologized in German military culture, now shattered and partitioned. As Soviet forces surged through the remnants of the Reich toward Berlin, the lessons of Memel were echoed in sieges across Pomerania and Silesia. Total encirclement, sustained artillery bombardment, urban attrition, and psychological collapse. Politically, the city's fate became entangled in Cold War realities. While the West never formally recognized the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states, it took no action to reverse it. Klaipėda's integration into the Lithuanian SSR was treated as a fait accompli, and its former German inhabitants were left stateless or absorbed into West German refugee communities. In diplomatic terms, Memel simply vanished from the map, absorbed into the broader silence surrounding Soviet occupation. Decades later, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Klaipėda would re-emerge as a Lithuanian city once again, still bearing the scars of its wartime past. Post-Soviet governments undertook efforts to restore some of the city's pre-war heritage, though much of it had been irrevocably lost. New memorials were erected to acknowledge all victims of the conflict, and historical commissions began investigating the full extent of population displacements, war crimes, and cultural destruction. Yet even in this restored memory, the siege of Memel remained a relatively obscure chapter compared to more prominent battles of World War II. Overshadowed by events in Berlin, Warsaw, or Stalingrad, its importance was localized, its devastation personal rather than iconic. For those who lived through it, however, the siege was no less defining, a final conflagration that ended one history and forcibly began another. The legacy of Memel is thus multifaceted. Militarily, it marked the disintegration of Germany's northeastern defenses. Politically, it facilitated the Soviet reordering of the Baltic coast. Culturally, it represented the extinction of a centuries-old community and the imposition of a new identity forged in rubble and ideology. In the end, Memel's story is not simply about a siege, but about transformation through violence, of cities, peoples, and historical memory itself.